try to take pictures of what and I say, hey, you know, that I think that's uncouth, so please don't. But do write it down. It'll help you remember it. In other words, in some ways, I think the old-fashioned way is the best way. All right, Hebrews. Now, folk, every secular history book I read about Israel, they always make it a point to contradict something that the Bible says about them. And your authors are no exception. The authors come out plainly and say that they doubt the story that the Israelis tell. And they also come out plain and say that they doubt that David and Solomon, if they even existed at all, had any kingdom that's as powerful as the ones mentioned in the Bible. And folk, I mean, if they don't doubt one aspect of it, they doubt another. Now, I want to tell you something about how the Hebrews kept their history. Unlike the Egyptians, who trusted their history only with scholars, there was only a certain caste of priests who could keep history. And I think I've mentioned how that we know the Egyptians fudged. They put descendants and ancestors trading places. They added years that were not there. And they took dynasties that were contemporary and put them end to end. And I compared it to what if we wrote our history and put Jefferson Davis, the next president after Abraham Lincoln. And then especially put all of our governors and made them be presidents and put them end to end. We could make our history 3,000 years long. Just fine. I want to tell you how the Hebrews kept history. Number one, they wrote it in a book for everybody to read. But also, they go through a ceremony every Passover. They look around the room and decide, now who's the youngest person here? And of course, it has to be someone old enough to talk. So usually pick some preschool child. It can be male or female. Some preschool child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, but not someone who's too young to talk. But then they'll ask, well, who's the oldest person? They won't pick someone who doesn't have their mind yet. I mean, who's lost their mind due to Alzheimer's or something. But someone who still has their mind, but nevertheless old. Then they'll have this young child go up to this old person, and this child will ask the old person, why are we celebrating Passover tonight? And the older person will recite the story. Now, they have been doing this ceremony, folk, for 3,000 years. In order for them to have fabricated it, 2.5 million persons would have had to got together and said, let's make up a story and tell it to succeeding generations and make it sound like we believe it. Now, when I was in high school, a fellow classmate of mine, who also is a professor, but he's a professor in Ohio, now I always remember his words. He said to the teacher, Mr. Woods by name, but that's neither here nor there. He said, I don't believe that story that the Israelis tell. I'm a preacher's son. Well, on a personal note, I also am a preacher's son. I do believe the stories that they tell. Pretty much the way they tell them. Now, you can try to seek rational explanations for it. And I've read books by Jewish authors who have tried to seek a rational explanation. How could the Red Sea have parted? Well, maybe an earthquake rose the ground temporarily and then it sunk back in place. Velikovsky said that the planet Mars used to come close to Earth, and it created earthquakes and all kinds of issues. Again, yes?
There's a low tide, and then in the low tide there's a land bridge that went across the Red Sea.
That is one natural explanation. I mean, but you still have to explain all the bugs, the frogs, the lice, the blood, and all the other stuff, and the death of all the firstborn. In other words, there are many and numerous parts of this story. You have to, I mean, if you want to seek a rational explanation, but there have been many explanations for how that the Jews could have crossed on dry land, crossed the Red Sea, and then when Pharaoh's army got the Red Sea, bang, the Red Sea drowned the whole army. Numerous explanations, folks, rational, whatever. Again, each of you, you're all adults here. You can make up your mind for yourself what you believe. There have been some movies made about it. One movie, particularly called The Exodus, that was made in the early 1960s. And no, Ten Commandments. The title of it is The Ten Commandments. And then there was another animated cartoon. And does anybody happen to recall the name of the cartoon? I've had what's that? Oh, Prince of Egypt. Thank you. All right. My children watched that over and over again, and this morning I had one student who said that she had seen it. And anyways, the movie is Prince of Egypt, animated cartoon, describing the same thing. All right, leaving that. Now, according to their own account, now I've already mentioned how that the word nation means descended from one person. The Jews claimed that they were descended from Abraham. And Abraham had several sons, but one of them was named Isaac. And then Isaac had a couple of sons, one of them named Jacob. And Jacob changed his name to Israel, and that's where we get to the word Israel. So they claimed that they were descended from Israel, a grandson of Abraham. Hence they called themselves children of Israel. According to their own story, they went to Egypt and spent 400 years in Egypt. At first they were welcomed in Egypt by Pharaoh, but life being short, the old Pharaoh died and the dynasty was overthrown. Eventually a new dynasty came in who enslaved the children of Israel. And the children of Israel remained slaves for several generations. And then came Moses. Among African Americans of 200 years ago, their favorite Bible character was Moses. Does anybody have any idea why? Moses is famous for freeing slaves. Yeah, he freed the slaves. Well, so among African Americans, they would read the story of Moses over and over again, and when Moses going before Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh wouldn't do it. And Moses grew up in Pharaoh's house. I'm going to be mentioning this again. I mean, there are three ancient persons who supposedly were thrown in a basket and left to drown: Moses, Sargon, and Cyrus the Great. Cyrus we'll talk about in a few minutes. But anyway, Moses was thrown in a basket, and Pharaoh's daughter found him, and he was brought up in Pharaoh's palace. Then he killed an Egyptian taskmaster. For this, when it was found out, he fled and roamed the desert for 40 years. Then went back and told Pharaoh to let the people go, and eventually freed the slaves. And led them in the wilderness for some 40 years while they roamed around the wilderness, and then led them into the land of Canaan. Now, from the land of Canaan, of course, is the land of the day we call Israel. And folk, I must state this. There are persons who are really upset that what right did the Jews have to take over land that wasn't theirs. I want to remind you of a couple of things. Number one, every human being alive today is living on land that its ancestors took from somebody else. There are no exceptions. Now, I did some research on my genealogy beginning about 30 years ago, and some of my ancestors were Indian fighters. Took land that had once belonged to the Indians. Was it morally right? That's a separate issue. But the fact is, they did. Every human. Now, also, I had a student from that part of the world. Some people call it South Asia, but the Arab world. What right did they have? And I felt like saying to him, so I'm going to say it now. Have your people ever taken land from anybody else throughout history? Ever conquered other lands? The answer is every bit of land they have, they took from somebody else. Anyway, so now there is another aspect to it too. Now, when the United States, people of the United States moved in and took land from the Indians, they justified it on the grounds that our society is better than theirs, and therefore we have a duty and obligation to conquer. And this, by the way, this was the logic used by conquering people up until about 120 years ago. Conquest was looked on as being a virtue, by virtue of conquest. The people living in Canaan had some really abominable practices, and one of them was their religion had fertility cults. The effect of fertility cult was where several young women would serve as prostitutes, and they would allow men to come in and have sex with them, and that any babies that were born as a result of this union would be offered as a sacrifice to the gods. So these people were sacrificing their babies to Molech, to Baal, and the gods of the Canaanites. the Israelis said this practice is abominable, therefore we are justified in taking land. Now, in our own American history, folk, as recently as 500 years ago, the year was 1521, just short of 500 years ago, a man named Cortez came to Mexico, and he heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from the temple. He asked, well, what's the meaning of these screams? There was a lady there who had a gift of interpreting languages. Some people can learn them fast. I can't. But anyway, there was a lady there who said, Cortez, these are people being offered to sacrifice the sun god, to feed the sun god, to keep him happy. Now, Cortez's conscience was shocked. He turned to Montezuma and said, your gods are not gods but devils. I'm going to repeat his story later in the semester. This created a few tense moments between Montezuma and Cortez, but some peacekeepers moved in temporarily. And I ask the class every time I teach, what would you have done if you had been there with Cortez and heard the screams going to the temple? Modern day political correctness does not have an answer to this. Well, it's their religion. Who's to say that one religion is any better than another? And who's to say but what they might have been right and we're wrong? Let them do it. No, Cortez conquered the Aztecs and put a stop to it. And the people of the day believed he was fully justified. No, by today's standards, I don't know what we think. But in other words, this has happened more than once down through history. People will see people living under conditions that, hey, this is abominable. We got to stop this, what they're doing to each other, and move in and conquer them. So the Israelis, again, now the other side of it is, the people living at that time would have problems with raiding parties coming in. A raiding party would come in, take what they wanted of yours, and go off with it. So supposing you lived in Israel at the time, and a Philistine raiding party would come in, taking a couple of your children and all your valuable stuff, and then going on. You either had one of two choices: just let them have it, or you could fight back. Again, you can decide for yourself the morality of it. The Israelis oftentimes chose to fight back and fight hard and destroy the people who were destroyed. That's not.
You mean like now, right?
Today too. I mean, okay. The conflict that is going on August 25th, 2014, has been going on in that part of the world for 3,000 years. Off and on again, 3,000 years. Even when the Jews were kicked out of their homeland, the people living there fought each other hard, all the time. It's like I said in the last class, they accuse us of our Constitution failure. We had 4 years of civil war. They have never had 4 years of civil peace.
I mean, do you think it has anything to do with anything that's not religious?
Okay, say again.
Does that have anything to do with anything that doesn't involve religion? Like maybe resources?
It almost always involves religion of a sort. Almost every bit of it involves religion. I mean, I have to say that because it is so.
I mean,
Okay.
you say that, but like...
Well, what else is involved in their land? Maybe they want their
land
neighbors.
and resources.
Land and resources. Hardly ever these people fight over land and
That area is
resources.
very, very low on resources, except for...
Low on resources except for oil, but they didn't even know about oil until 1905.
Oil in other parts of the world.
What's that?
There's oil in other parts of the world.
Yeah, there's an oil in other parts of the world that's been discovered. Now Saddam Hussein supposedly fought over oil, Kuwait's oil, and he was driven out of Kuwait. But most of it seems to be, I mean, they just fight endlessly, one after another. The wars do not stop. All right, anyway, the Jews moved in, took possession of part of the land. They never did have it all. Now, and again, your book questions, did they really, what they said about themselves really happened? Supposedly, eventually they had a powerful king named David. Now, David is also remembered for killing a giant called Goliath. And again, you can make up your mind for yourself whether giants existed, but I must remind you of something, folks. Every ancient peoples that we know of who have their stories come to us, every one of them have stories about giants. No exceptions. Yes?
So would you apply that same logic to dragons? Because every demon
Okay.
from
Why? How on the subject? Why would every group of people have dragon stories? I mean, the American Indians, the Chinese, the Europeans. Why would they make up dragons?
Yeah.
Say, what's that?
I mean, that's a whole other topic, to be honest.
It's the same type of giants, dragons,
saying, like-
the zodiac. All right, well, let's talk about what people have in common. The stories of dragons, stories of giants, stories of the zodiacs, the 7-day week cycle, with the seventh day being a holy day, stories of a flood with few survivors. All mankind have these stories. To me, it shows strong evidence that all mankind once was together in a small group, and these stories were told before they all scattered abroad.
I mean, I have my own personal belief. There's physical proof that like the human race has been like massively de-evolving for the past 25
What?
years. There is physical proof that like the human race has been like de-evolving the past like 2,500 years.
There's nothing you can say that I can agree with more. Thank you.
So,
That the human race is, hey, you missed my first two classes. The first class, the human race is devolving. Yes, devolving.
So I
Absolutely.
honestly believe that, like, I mean, no matter how crazy it sounds, I'm kind of a very spiritual person, but like, the fact that we don't use our brain as much as we do, like we did maybe 2,500 years ago, could say a lot. Kind of like.
You got to listen to my first two lectures. I mean, hey, folks, the class knows what you don't. I'm agreeing with you 100%. The people living back then were brighter in a lot of ways than we are. And their bodies were better. The Cro-Magnon man, the Neanderthal man, had a bigger brain than we have. He was bigger physically. You know about that already.
Well, yeah, people were also shorter back then.
Well, up to a point. I mean, hey, the human race declined, and then they started getting bigger. Now, if you look at the average size of the armor of the Middle Ages, European males averaged 4'6". Yeah, but now what happened? All right, okay. Listen, I need the floor. You two, I need the floor. So what happened? Why are we getting bigger? Personally, I think what it is they married during the Middle Ages, Europeans, and the Japanese are still doing this until recently, and the Chinese. The reason they're small is they tended to marry close in their community, not their cousins or sisters, but close in their community. Then a group of Europeans came to America. The Scots began to marry the Swede, and the marriages. In America, we tend to marry strangers. And this is good for our genes. It might not be always good socially. We tend to marry strangers. Some people particularly we're going to come to the Spartans. The Spartans made the mistake of, we only marry other Spartans. And what happened? Physically and mentally, they went downhill. If I could go back and say, hey, you people need to marry Persians, you need to marry Celts, you need to marry, go as far as China and pick Chinese, and go deep into the continent of Africa and marry Africans. Because if you do that, you'll create the race of supermen that you want. Yes?
You know, people in America are averagely taller than other people in the world.
Again, because Americans married over the horizon, married strangers. More so than people in other parts of. But I've noticed, to me, Oriental peoples are starting to get bigger. And again, I think it's because they're marrying over the horizon. Yes?
The average height for Americans is 5'10", but for people in the now Alps, which is in Netherlands, is 6'1".
Yeah, there are persons, but height is not everything. Height is not. Anyway, all right, we're getting a little bit off, but not that badly. All right. Again, did David and Solomon exist? Did they have the kingdoms? Whatever the story, according to the ancient Hebrew accounts, Solomon, when he died, the kingdom was split. You had the northern kingdom called Israel, and the southern kingdom called Judah. Again, because and the word Jew comes from the word Judah. Israel then was carried captive by Assyria after about 300 years, and then 100 years later, Judah was carried captive by Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Now, from that point on, we can believe what the Jews said. To make a long, yes.
So those were the 12 tribes?
Yeah, now the 12 tribes, 10 of them became the nation of Israel. And then Judah became its own. Judah was a separate tribe. It became its own nation. The 10 tribes of Israel, we don't know for sure what happened to them. But the best theory I've heard is that the Assyrians carried them to a river in Russia called the Volga River. And there have been Jewish communities found there. And they were so far removed from Israel, they never came back. But they never reassembled as a nation. As for Judah, within a generation, they came back. A king of Persia named Cyrus, whom we'll talk about shortly. Cyrus allowed them to return, and they rebuilt their temple, rebuilt their city, and eventually, now to make a long story short, they had to fight wars with its neighbors, the Syrians to the north, the Egyptians to the south. But under the leadership of the Maccabees, and some of you who know anything about Jewish history might have heard of the Maccabees, one of you. Under the Maccabees, they won their fight and became an independent country again. But when Rome came on the scene, nobody could, in that part of the world, could stand up to Rome. Rome conquered them, and eventually the Romans kicked them completely out of the land of Judea. They were to remain out of Judea for about 1900 years. In 1948, they reassembled as a nation. And the rest is, you might say, is history. All right, I'm going to have to pause.